Well, here we are in church on the Sunday before Christmas. And even here, where we take a very progressive approach to Scripture and where we are probably really more interfaith than we are specifically Christian, still, we are in a church in late December in the middle of the United States. And so we will sing some Christmas carols, tipping our hats to an incarnational theology that we do not believe. Showing respect to a heritage that deserves respect as a part of our faith journey. There may be more nostalgia to these things than there ever was sincere faith, but no matter how academic our prejudices may be, still our hearts are not made of stone. So we will follow a bit of tradition. I even put on a robe today, vestments for me are typically for either a wedding or a funeral. And I don't know how those two got put together, but I'm actually doing the part today. And I should note for holiday purposes that Barry is wearing a piano keyboard socks too. So we're both kind of going over the top today, aren't we, Barry? That's good. But you don't need for me to tell you again this year that the two birth narratives in the Gospels are late additions to the Jesus narrative. There are only two in the Bible, one in Matthew and one in Luke. And those two agree on little more than the sex of the child. All the details of the story are completely different. Neither tells us anything that is even remotely historical. Both Matthew and Luke record introductions to their Gospels that serve their respective theological interests, but they are both being entirely creative with their literary details. When Bishop Spong was here this past summer, he enumerated a list of contradictions between the two Christmas stories in the New Testament. But there was one difference that he didn't mention, and even as our favorite biblical scholar, I feel like I need to suss out that one point that Bishop Spong neglected to mention. In Matthew, the story is told entirely from the perspective of men. No big surprise. Joseph has some dreams, Joseph does some things, says some things, Herod gets a few lines, astrologers appear, but Mary is just quietly along for the ride, as if her role was insignificant. But in Luke, the text that we're reading from today, the story is told from Mary's perspective. And this is a theme for all of Luke. If there is a feminist that wrote a gospel, and there's not, but as close as it gets, would be the writing of Luke. In Luke, Mary speaks, and in fact, she speaks quite a bit. It is from this more active role in Luke that the church inherits a Mary who is more than just a womb that is carrying a divine plan. Mary doesn't get a great role in the Gospels, but she gets just enough for the later church to every generation hang a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more on her name. She becomes, in the evolving tradition of the church, not just a sinless young girl, but stories are created that insist that she also had a miraculous birth to a virgin, and even that her body never knew decay. There is the Assumption of Mary, in which angels, by tradition, carried her body up into heaven, where she was brought back to life and seated on a throne next to her enthroned Son. In our lifetime, even as recently as the last 50 years, she has been elevated to the station of co-redemptress with Jesus. And in many sects of the Roman Catholic Church, they no longer pretend to simply pray to and adore Mary as an intercessor, but they openly worship Mary as God, sharing in the job of redemption with Jesus. Now, none of this tells us anything about God or about Jesus or Mary, but it does tell us a lot about ourselves. The very male-dominated Christian religion has been struggling for centuries to turn God into a woman. A mother, a young, beautiful, loving mother who is an eternal virgin, lest you get any ideas. When the Christian religion spread to Alexandria in northern Africa, the emphasis on a popular female deity influenced the church in that region to give Mary the title of Theotokos, literally meaning Mother of God. In a span of just 300 years, Mary went from being a virgin mother of Jesus to the divine mother of God. But in the same time in Europe, artistic depictions of Jesus were becoming increasingly European and increasingly feminine. If you walk through an art museum, you can see that for nearly 1,000 years, the face of Jesus was pale, thin, and he had big brown eyes, and he was, in any realistic sense, not a rugged Middle Eastern man. He was a European woman who had a facial hair problem. The most ancient religions were dominated by female deities. So let's face it, though I've tried hard to be an involved, nurturing father for the most part, still mothers are the ones that are almost universally associated with compassion, with love, with forgiveness, with grace, with kindness. I resent the notion that men are always violent, controlling, condemning, and judging. But the assumption that men are violent, judging, and controlling is a theme that runs through history. People invent female gods because they need them. Protestants put up a solid 400-year-long fight to dethrone Mary and make the church an entirely male-centered institution. But you might note that the students in Protestant seminaries in this century are overwhelmingly female. In most seminaries, 70-80%. I am a member of the last generation of male-dominated clergy, and when I and my peers retire, I don't expect that we will be much missed. This text that Avery read for us this morning is the only sermon in the New Testament delivered by a woman, and it is no recounting of angels singing and cattle lowing and the sweet breath of a baby and kneeling shepherds in a manger. It's a sermon about a radical reversal of power. Not hard to see that rich and powerful men are being cast down, and those who have not been in power are being lifted up. And it doesn't take a feminist theologian to guess who the disempowered and the poor that are being lifted up, who that might be. You could almost blame Mary then for 20 centuries that followed this sermon, during which women were no longer allowed to speak in churches, where male priests did the bidding of bankers and blessed the warmongering goals of kings, prime ministers, and presidents. There are churches, schools, monasteries, universities, the world over, that are named for Mary. Mary's image is cast in icons, stained glass windows, and in statues in sacred places in every corner of the Catholic and Orthodox world, where she is loved, adored, prayed to, and often worshiped. But in none of those places would she be allowed to preach a sermon. And therein lies the real irony of religion and the half of the population that happens to not have male genitalia. For most modern history, religions, governments, businesses, and families have been ferociously male-dominated. We adore women, we objectify them, we use them to sell everything from home cleaning products to cars, but resolutely refuse to pay them the same thing that we pay men, while jealously, publicly guarding their virginity and simultaneously feeding them to the sex industry. Mary, as a vulnerable, unwed, Middle Eastern pregnant girl, is a pretty ironic image to stand at the starting line of the Christian story, especially in a year when we have so many presidential candidates and state governors who are adamantly refusing to accept Syrian refugees, even women and children, as they are running from their lives from the civil war in Syria. The image of Mary deserves a place in our faith conversations, but I think that image should look a lot more like Malala Yousafzai, and in fact, to the extent that Mary may have been a historical figure, she would have looked a lot more like Malala Yousafzai than any image you've seen in any of our churches. But even more, I want to raise the point about how women are being treated right here in the United States, especially among the minority population. We've heard a lot about the school-to-prison pipeline in recent years, usually in connection to the numbers of black men who have been taken almost directly from high school to a life of incarceration. But recently, President Obama mentioned a study that had previously not come to my attention, a study about black women in the prison system entitled The Sex Abuse to Prison Pipeline. Because there are a huge number of women of color in prison. And of that ever-growing population, 75% of these young women have been sexually accosted. Many of them were charged with assault and sentenced to prison for steps they took to defend themselves against sexual assault. Now, this isn't much of a holiday story, folks, I'm sorry. But if you remove father figures from minority families through incarceration and unemployment, right, there are a lot of baby daddies that simply run because they cannot provide for a family. The minority kids oftentimes end up in foster care, a system often rife with abuse. And then as they age out of foster care, pimps on both sides of the Atlantic and in Eastern Europe, women age out of orphanages and their foster care system at middle teen years, 14, 15. Pimps and abusers are there to snatch them up. Almost every Caucasian prostitute in North America came straight out of an orphanage in Eastern Europe and was trafficked to the United States. Were your kids at the age of 17 or 18 ready to live on their own? And you think about aging out of foster care. Could you have simply said to them at 17 or 18, it's time for you to get out of the house and take care of yourself? My daughter couldn't do it, and my daughter was wonderful. And she had nearly every advantage. She had not been abused. She had a middle-class American life, a good education. But at the age of 18, she was no more prepared to live on her own than I am currently prepared to be the Tsar of Russia. Absolutely not there. Now, we all remember the video of police officer Ben Fields literally throwing a South Carolina teenage girl across the classroom because she was being, after all, non-compliant about putting away her cell phone. I cannot tell you how many times my daughter has been non-compliant about putting away her cell phone. But that young woman was going through hell in the foster care system with a disintegrating family. And even though she was acting out those frustrations inappropriately, what on earth would make a trained professional believe that he could treat her that way? Could it be because she was black? I'm not saying he was a racist. No, he was a racist. But possibly even more than that, she didn't have a father in her life. Let me tell you, that wouldn't have happened to my daughter. And my daughter isn't even white, but she has a father at home. A father who has a penchant not only for writing letters to the editor, but in this case, and I hate to sound like I would go all Robert the Bruce, but I don't know how I would have controlled myself if I had seen a man treating my daughter that way. He might have had to kill me. We started putting police officers in schools to protect students. But look how quickly the police started treating students in a way that made the students believe they had to be protected from the police. So every Christmas, Mary sings a song in church about how the powerful are being cast down and the lowly are being lifted up. And then it's New Year's, and then it's Valentine's Day, and then it's spring, and the numbers of young black victims of sexual abuse keep going to jail. Their numbers in jail have grown by over 600% in the last 35 years. So maybe we should trot out our little brown mother of the faith more often. to hear her voice more clearly. We don't need to worship her. We don't need to protect her virginity, but we do need to listen to her. And we do need to respect her. And we sure ought to make sure that she gets a decent education and a job and a fair salary. We need to stop building more prisons and start building more colleges. We need to stop trying to militantly control her and start giving her a reason to respect herself and to confidently take her place in school, in the workplace, and eventually in the pulpit. When you help young black women, you inevitably help black families, black men, black-owned businesses. When you help black women, you help the whole community where black women live. When we stop accepting the marginalized and the sexual abuse of black women, then we all have a better shot at having a Merry Christmas for real.
Amen.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.